Welcome to the Thrive in China podcast from Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. The China Expert Series is here to educate and celebrate mistakes made by foreign investors whilst doing business in China. It includes personal stories from the China experts on the challenges they've experienced in the market, how they've overcome them, and what pieces of advice they can share with those of you who are just starting out. My name is Christina Kohler-Coluccia, and I'm a Hong Kong-born European with over 20 years experience in helping foreign investors enter the China and Hong Kong market. My mission is to help foreign investors, leaders, entrepreneurs avoid the most common obstacles that they encounter along their China business journey for them to accelerate their profitability. I hope you enjoy the episode. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of our Thrive in China podcast. In today's episode, I am very pleased to have Ben Rotheram from the CBBC diving in from Shanghai as well. And as usual, I'm never the best to introduce people. I want Ben to do that himself. So Ben, why don't we kick off today with you just explaining who you are, where you're from, what you do, and then we'll delve into further questions.
Absolutely. Right. Well, thanks very much, Christina. And hello to everyone listening to the podcast. So yes, my name is Ben Rotheram and I work for the China-Britain Business Council, the CBBC, and I'm based here in our Shanghai office. We're in the center of Shanghai here. As you can probably tell by my accent, I'm not from China originally. I'm from the UK. CBBC is, of course, a UK-China bilateral organization. But I've been out in China for quite a while now, most of the time since 2009. And I've spent quite a bit of that time at CBBC. I'm just coming up to 6 years with the organization now. And I'm the Director of Service Delivery in China as well at CBBC. Should probably mention that.
And I'll probably just also highlight Woodburn has been a member of the CBBC since 2018, but myself, I've been a part of the organization, and by part I mean a member of through my other companies, probably longer than you've been there, Ben, but I don't even remember the starting date.
I could check our records if you want, but that wouldn't make it
since 2004, 2005. I don't even remember properly. But let me also give a bit of an insight on, as a member of the CBBC, and also why I wanted Ben to come onto the podcast. What's the value of the China-Britain Business Council? Because I think that's something that people need to be aware of, and that an organization like this tends to exist in almost every jurisdiction. Yeah. The CBBC is a UK-based organization, and it helps UK companies, but also Chinese companies who are interested in the bilateral trade, if you will, or service transactions. I don't know. I mean, it depends on what industry and sector you're in. What I have found fantastic about the CBBC from my perspective as a corporate services firm is that I tend to meet a lot of new UK companies on an annual basis that are interested in China, whether they are in their infancy stage of just trying to get to know China, or whether they are further along their journey and they actually want to physically do something in the Chinese market, whether it's transact, whether it's set up an entity. You know, I'm always more on the administrative side of things, but it's you have companies that are on all phases of their journey. And it's not just for big name brands, big name companies. It's really catered also to the small, medium-sized companies. It is a great networking tool, great way to meet people, great way to hear people's stories. And then obviously the CBBC offers actual services, which, Ben, I don't know if you want to highlight briefly the types of services you guys offer.
Absolutely, yeah. I can come back and give the spiel later on in the podcast. Let's go through some of it very briefly now. But yes, as Christina said there, yes, the China-British Business Council. We were set up in 1954, so we are not new. I know I've been listening to some other episodes of this podcast, and there are some fantastic new service providers operating within the UK-China space and new and international space, many of which are our members, many of which we of course collaborate with. We have been around a good while though. Next year is in fact our 70th anniversary. And we have continued to offer great services through all those years. I think probably best to sum us up with the 3 words that are our slogan: advice, analysis, access. So what is it that we are providing? We're providing, say, advocacy work in both the UK and China, so bringing stakeholders together, amplifying their voices, enabling that B2B and B2G dialogue to happen and to be deepened to the benefit of both sides. We also stage a wide range of events. I know before we started recording, Christina and I were just very briefly talking about the great events, the China Consumer event earlier this year that we put on. We put on events throughout the year, both under our own name and also working with a range of partners, particularly from, say, UK government. Recently in the UK, for example, in fact, just this week, we are holding an event for a delegation from Anhui province over to the UK, gone very successfully. That is somewhat modelled on a couple of events we held earlier this year, also in the UK in London, for Guangdong province and for Shanghai. And actually, there's quite an interesting contrast there, because, of course, when you're in London and you mention Shanghai, you mention Guangdong, people have heard of these. When you mention Anhui, the first question is often, what is an Anhui? It's a place. And where is Anhui? And so on and so forth. And it's great to be able to introduce those companies that we know, those MNCs, but also those SMEs that you mentioned there, Christina, to potential Chinese partners, potential Chinese clients, potential Chinese stakeholders across the country. We have got 9 offices throughout China, so it's not just the big 4 cities of Beijing, Shenzhen, Shanghai and Guangzhou. Our reach is wider than that. And of course, in the UK, our reach is not just London, it is throughout the UK that we have a presence. I'd also point out, as well as the advocacy side of what we do, as well as the events side of what we do, we also carry out wide range of market research. Just what is China? Where should I be interested in China? What's going on in China? Who do I need to speak to in China? What do I need to do in China? What don't I need to do in China? And what should I avoid like the plague in China? These sorts of things. Whether it's just, market entry, well, not just, that's often the most important thing, but whether it's market entry research, starting from zero, whether it's helping you find partners, whether you're offering your goods or your services to China, whether it is carrying out some, say, competitor analysis or looking at your digital footprint in China. We've got sector teams, sector specialists that can offer all of these services. And I'm aware a lot of what I've said so far sounds like we are promoting the opportunities in China to the UK, which is what we do. And there are massive amounts of opportunities here. But we are a bilateral organization. Certainly, probably for most of the majority of that 70-year history, traffic was more in that way, helping those UK members make the most of the China market. But of course, really, in the last decade, and even more recently than that, we've seen a lot more traffic going the other direction. So everything that I've just mentioned, really, you could swap round the words UK and China, and it is still absolutely true. Increasing numbers of our members come from the China side as well. So we really do sit at that junction of UK and China business relations, business interactions. And it is great that through Woodburn and through previous organizations, you've been a member for so long, Christina. Hopefully we can continue to provide you with a worthwhile service.
Absolutely. Well, I think also the other thing that I would highlight is education, because I preach on about market research and data and all of these things. Yeah. But I think also a big component or a motto that I use almost daily is knowledge is power in China.
Yes.
The more you know, the more leverage you will have to negotiate, to understand what to do next as action plans, how to execute, etc. And I think the CBBC is also a great avenue there, where even me, I mean, I call myself a China experienced hand, having arrived in 2003 in Shanghai. I know a lot, but I don't know everything. And there are some things that I also have to update myself on, right?
Yeah.
And that's an avenue. Ben was talking about the China Consumer Day conference. I don't do marketing. I'm not a brand strategist by any means, but it's lovely to go to an event like that and hear not only from brands, but also hear from brand strategists and marketeers and whatnot. What's the trend right now? What's happening right now? It's a great educational avenue where anybody can learn. And I think we'll stop preaching about the CBBC there, but it is a great organization. That if you are a UK company, take advantage of it, because you never know what you can actually get out of it.
You do make a point there, though. Yes, a very good point. That knowledge is power, certainly, especially when it comes to a country like China. It is very difficult to find out enough about China when looking at, say, international multi-country, say, generalist news sources, for example. Obviously, there are many, many great news providers about China, but just like, take, say, a country such as, I don't know, India, which is a country which I've unfortunately yet to have the chance to visit, but obviously it's a very interesting economy, the most populous country in the world, etc. What I know about India right now is from standard news broadcasters, etc. I would not feel confident, no matter how much I read about that just from such general resources, to actually start talking about the business environment in India with any degree of certainty or clarity. I would need to find some source of information that is specifically talking about India from India specialists. And yeah, one last point about CBBC. I think that is CBBC. We are not the only ones by any point, of course. Woodburn are another one. There are many others. But yes, I think you are right. That knowledge is power. And whenever you're interested in any foreign market, whether it is investing, whether it is looking to offer your goods, whether it is looking to offer your services, whether it is looking to attract them to you even, you do need to find those channels, those resources that have that quite relatively narrow focus, so that you can delve a lot deeper.
So Ben, let's start from the beginning, because the audience tends to like everybody's individual stories on how they ended up in China, the obstacles they encountered along their career path. And then obviously, I always want to pinpoint the successes, because although China is complex and complicated and we've all run into obstacles, it doesn't mean we haven't succeeded. So perhaps you can start off a little bit with your history with China. How did you end up there?
Okay. I came here in February 2009. Before I came to live here, I had never visited China. I didn't know anyone who'd ever visited China. I don't think I knew anyone who was Chinese.
That's super brave.
I had never studied any aspect of the language. When I was at university, I studied economics at university. There was a couple of modules about developing economies there, about emerging economies and economic development, which I took, and China featured in those inevitably. But I knew nothing about China when I remember I was on the plane. I flew London to Hong Kong, and then I had a 14-hour layover in Hong Kong airport to fly to Wuhan the next morning, which was the first city I worked in China. And I hadn't left the country. I hadn't left the UK for years prior to that. So when I booked the plane ticket, and I booked it, this was 2008 when I booked it. So I booked it the old-fashioned way, phoning up the company. And they said, did you want us to put you in a hotel in Hong Kong so you can explore Hong Kong in that 14-hour layover? And my first thought was, oh no, I'll get lost if I do that. I missed my second plane. So I just sat in the airport in Hong Kong for 14 hours on my own. But there we go. It was 2008, summer 2008, when I decided that I wanted to come over here. That was, of course, the summer of the Beijing Olympics. I'm not sure if that's what influenced me. Maybe it did, and demonstrating the impact of soft power. It was also, of course, towards the end of that year was when the financial crisis hit. So certainly there weren't a lot of jobs in the UK back then, especially for a young graduate like I was. And China was just on everybody's lips. People were talking about it. So I thought, why not? And I remember being on that second plane from Hong Kong to Wuhan, and I bought. I didn't have a smartphone, which was good because in China no one had smartphones back then. I had to buy a black and white one when I arrived. But I had one of those little pocket dictionaries by Langenscheidt, the German company, and they had a list of the numbers 1 to 10, and I tried to learn the numbers 1 to 10 on the flight. that was the extent of my Chinese knowledge. So it was a complete shot in the dark, and I went over to Wuhan, which I mean everybody's heard of Wuhan these days, haven't they?
They have, but I also want to highlight in 2009.
Oh yeah, I knew it before it was famous, before it went mainstream. Yeah,
it's not Beijing. It in those days but some people may even consider in 2023 that it's the Wild Wild West, but back then it really was the Wild Wild West. I just want to say that and give Ben and to give Ben some credit here for going to Wuhan of all places.
It was quite the eye-opener, you can imagine. Yeah. And I was over there as an English teacher, as so many people were back then. I suppose you still see quite a few people doing that. The education sector in China has become a lot more standardized, certainly since then, a lot more professionalized for the better, really. It was the case when I came over here to be a teacher. Great, you're a foreigner, you can speak English, stand in front of these children and speak, sort of thing. And thankfully, I think it is much less like that now because education standards have risen massively, even in the 14, 15 years since then. But yeah, I came over here on a 1-year contract, fully expecting it to be the sort of thing that I would do for a year, go back to the UK, and then, 4 or 5 years hence, the sort of thing where if China comes up in a conversation, I could say, oh yeah, I lived in China for a year. It was interesting. I've been to Wuhan. But things didn't turn out like that. And it's 2023, nearly 2024, and I'm still here. So there we go.
And you finished the 1 year. Did you stay teaching or did you move around? You mentioned to me before recording that you were up in Beijing as well. How was the turnaround to end up then in Shanghai with the CBBC?
I was in Wuhan for 18 months in the end. I slightly extended the contract there, which, again, contracts. Back then, extending the contract consisted of popping your head around the door of the boss's office and saying, "Can I stay for an extra 6 months?" And then saying, "Yeah, okay. And that was it. That was the extent of the contract negotiation. I don't think it's like that now. There we are. Then I was in Qingdao for 4 years, also teaching. So that was 5.5 years teaching, which was probably... it's very interesting doing that, being an English teacher in China. It was certainly back then, and certainly for any of your listeners who are new graduates who are maybe not quite sure what they want to do with their career, with their life, try it in China. It's great fun. But that was probably a bit too long, 5 years of teaching. Sometimes, as is the case with many businesses coming to China, you've found your own little patch and you aren't entirely sure how to step out of it. You look at businesses exporting to Western Europe, America, Canada, and China is there. How do I get there? What step do I take next? And when you're safely ensconced in that teaching world in your mid-20s, that there is a much wider business world out there. But how do you get there, especially when you're in the suburbs of Wuhan or the suburbs of Qingdao or something like this? So I ended up leaving China for a couple of years in 2014. I came back mainly because my wife got another job in another country, so I went with her. And then we came back to China in 2016. I then studied Chinese for a year in Beijing, which was a wonderful, wonderful experience. Something I should have done years prior to that, to be
Mm.
honest with you. Um,
I
Chinese.
agree with you, actually. I mean, I learned Chinese
Hmm.
a lot by doing and taking evening courses, but that is probably, you know what my biggest regret is I took Chinese at university. And
But had you been to China prior to starting doing that?
well, I'm born and raised in Hong Kong.
Oh,
So
okay, okay.
it just kind of, I went to university in the US, did my first year where
Hmm.
I focused on Mandarin. I was pretty good after a year.
Yeah.
I mean, not only was I impressed with myself, but the environment was impressed, especially when I went home for Christmas and I could suddenly understand for the first time ever the place I was living in. And I then got a bit rebellious and said to my family, well, I'm never living in Asia ever again. There's no point in me learning Mandarin. And so I stopped, and that's probably my biggest regret.
It's never too late. It's never too
You're
late.
right, it is never too late. But that is also my regret having, when I first arrived in 2003 to Shanghai, that I didn't take that 1 year to be more serious about it. To really, I don't know, be delved in a classroom, fully focused on it. It's probably something I would recommend to a lot of the foreigners now that are heading over. Take that time
It's
to
always
learn.
worth it.
Yeah,
And
I agree, because you always end up staying longer than you
do.
anticipate.
I remember when I was and ahhing over whether to do that. I was 30 when I did that. And I remember thinking, oh, 30, time to be serious now. It's the
Yeah,
Chinese saying, if the san li,
yeah,
at 30, things get serious. It's
yeah.
the general idea, of course. But thinking, oh no, I can't take a year out. I'll be 30. That's ridiculous. And you look back and you think, it's only a year.
Yeah, but I mean, I
Thankfully,
think
I did
whatever
that.
age you're at, if you're moving over at 35, if you're moving over at 40, I would honestly,
Still say yes.
yeah, I
Yeah.
would do it. Yeah,
Why?
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And then I then joined CBBC in Beijing as an intern, somewhat more than
Okay.
an intern. And yeah, I just took it from there, really. They offered me a job after the internship. So I was the editor here. And then I was assistant director of client services. Then I was the full-time project lead for a multi-year project we have with the UK government, delivering that. And then I moved into my current role, and I moved from our Beijing office to Shanghai office about 3 years ago. And it is when you're, whether you're foreign or Chinese, if you're working for an organization in China that's got multiple offices, it is great to be able to have the opportunity to work in multiple offices there. It's probably quite different from the UK because the UK is a wonderful place, and I still really like British culture. But the difference between, say, if you are working in, I don't know, the Liverpool office and the Leeds office or the Newcastle office or the Sheffield office. Yes, those cities all have their own particularities, but it's not
Too
that far
different.
apart. It's not, oh, wow, this is utterly different. I've moved from Leeds to Liverpool, that sort of
So
thing.
let me ask you then a controversial question.
Are you going to ask me whether I prefer Beijing or Shanghai?
No, I'm going to ask you actually something more
Okay.
detailed. You've been in Wuhan, you've been in
Yeah.
Qingdao, you've been in Beijing, and now in Shanghai.
Yeah.
What is your preferred city?
Um, for food, in terms of local cuisine, which is how many people in China judge cities, let's be honest, I still think Wuhan has the best food of those four.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Okay.
oh yeah, good
Okay.
food in Wuhan, fantastic food.
I just want to pinpoint to people, he started with food. So
Cool.
I want to highlight that food, I think people underestimate this. Food is culturally in China huge.
Yeah.
So I'm happy you started with food. Keep going.
Oh yes. So you two people meet each other. They're from different provinces. Meet each other. Name, province. Oh, in that province, you eat this. Blah blah blah.
Yeah,
Oh, we
yeah.
also did. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's You know how in the US you start off conversations by talking about, or even in the UK, you start talking about the Premier League and different football
Yeah,
teams. In China, you start talking about food.
exactly. And it's just as competitive, the food, as when you're talking about different
Exactly.
Premiership teams. Yeah. But yeah. But overall, I think Shanghai. Possibly that's a sort of recency bias, or the fact that you know I really really enjoy my job. I enjoyed it in Beijing as well with CBBC, but you know it just gets better and better as time goes on.
Mm,
Whether it's the job, whether it's the social circle, the business circle that I've got here, Shanghai is, I think, more than those other three cities. Shanghai is one of those places where it feels like almost everybody comes from somewhere else.
including the Chinese.
Everybody is bringing their own story and their own background and
But I think
history.
that's the
Converging.
Chinese themselves also. I mean, you won't necessarily meet just Shanghainese in Shanghai. You will
Well, that's
meet,
what I mean. Yeah, I mean the
you know,
Chinese
yeah,
specifically.
yeah,
China, you know, Shanghai is
exactly.
like, say, New York or London in that case. You've got
Yes.
people from all over China and
Yeah,
indeed further afield, all congregating in this
yeah,
city. And
yeah.
that never stops being exciting and
And interesting.
interesting and
Yeah,
different. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm curious, with your time, how long have you been with the CBBC? You mentioned six,
It's just
7
come up to
years?
6 years now.
6 years.
6 years. Yeah.
So you've met a lot of companies.
Yeah.
And let me first talk about the inbound investment.
Mm.
Um, what challenges over the last 6 years have you seen these companies face? Obviously, probably the biggest one is COVID. I get that. But separate from that, what have you seen as being day-to-day blockages in their decision making or their journeys or whatever else?
Okay. I would say, I mean, the sort of companies I speak to, because of the role I have, I'm more on our commercial side. So delivering that sort of market
Mm,
research, etc., whatever market research may entail. And also, I directly manage a couple of our big long-term
mhm,
contracts that we
mhm,
have with UK government,
mhm.
etc. So I tend to speak much more to SMEs
Right,
than the MNCs.
right.
And I think there are certainly a few blockages, a few sort of pain points that they do
Mm,
come across on a regular basis. I think one that stands out recently is the PIPL, the PIPL, the Personal Information Protection Law.
yeah.
This was brought into play, I think it was 2021. It is very much China's equivalent of GDPR.
Yes.
And so much of what companies are offering now to the China space, and indeed so many companies looking to invest in China from the UK as well. There is, say, a digital element to what it is. There is a smart element to
Mm,
it. You know, we are not just talking about companies directly within the IT sector. I'm talking,
mm,
green tech involves a smart element, sometimes an element of collecting people's personal information. Med tech is an obvious
mm,
example, consumer wearables, so on and so forth. The PIPL is China's basic equivalent of GDPR. There are some who argue in some ways it's even stricter than GDPR. Certainly when I first came to China, and when you were first here in 2003, China was, to use that phrase you used before, an absolute wild west when it came to things like data protection. The pendulum has completely swung.
I'm
We
sorry.
are 100.
What data protection?
Oh yeah, yeah. That word wasn't in the dictionary back
It was.
then.
I don't even think there was a Chinese term
Yeah.
for
But things have changed. It's been a complete, 180-degree turn there. China does take this very strictly now, and you need to be considering, if you are going to be collecting any personal data, how will that be stored in China? How will it be protected? What needs to be transferred? What would it make sense to actually not transfer in China, even if that means your operations in China are done slightly differently from your
it.
operations in other third countries? So that has been.
So can I just ask you your perspective on something? So WeChat, I
Mm,
just published a guide today on the WeChat ecosystem.
yeah.
And actually just a week ago, I had a conversation with a UK client of mine about the use of WeChat. And I think a lot of people don't realize that WeChat is a personal tool. It's
Yeah.
not a company tool, right?
Yeah.
What is, and I don't know what your own policy is, considering WeChat is a personal tool. What is CBBC's policy on WeChat as a tool? But one of the things that last week shocked me was when they were like, oh yeah, our logistics provider, they're sending us and they were saying it so nonchalantly. Oh yeah, they're sending us the customs duty forms via WeChat, so we have everything. I said, they're doing what? They're doing what? Yeah, they're sending us all the customs data. I said, I get they're sending it, but how? How are they doing it? Yeah, I mean, everybody does it. And I was
Yeah.
like, I get it, but you
But
understand
yeah.
the protection, and that, do you realize it's a personal tool? So these individuals, regardless of their company, are sending company data over a personal tool to your employee personal account. And there's no tracking, right? So I'm curious for you. I bring it up because this is brand new and you're talking about data protection and personal data protection. And I
Yeah.
think WeChat plays a big role in this. What do you see on the ground?
There is quite a lot of that. And certainly when you work with, whether it's Chinese partners, Chinese clients, they, you get asked on a fairly regular basis, can I share this with you on WeChat? If you could just fill it in and send it back on WeChat. And certainly we at CBBC, of course, we always want a paper trail for everything. So we do ask email addresses. And this is where, and this can actually be a shock sometimes when we have UK clients and Chinese clients and bringing them together. The Chinese client may work for a fairly large Chinese company. Their email address is, 5679238
At
XYZ at
qq.com.
qq.com. And it just doesn't look like a work email account because it isn't. And that is indicative of the fact that, yes, despite, say, data protection laws, I think still quite a lot of maybe China to China company business is done much more through and WeChat. But certainly that is, we would say at CBBC, that is clearly not best practice. You do need to make sure as a foreign company, you are sticking to the letter of the law.
Right.
The personal information protection law, upon first reading, can seem quite onerous. But as long as you read it slowly and take those steps one by one, it's actually pretty clear what you need to do. And there are lots of service providers that can support you with that. And certainly, if ever a Chinese partner, a Chinese distributor, a Chinese investor, whatever, wants to share content with you via WeChat or simply goes ahead and just sends you the thing, certainly don't feel afraid to just say to them that, could you please resend it via email? It's just the way that it's the way that we do things in our company, just so I can have the paper trail. Nobody will mind that. They might think slightly different, but nobody will mind.
No, I mean, they'll probably think honestly, I think they'll think you're very old-fashioned and you're not up to date with the trends. But it's up to you to decide what your company policy is and how you want to operate, right? And either you get peer pressure by saying you're not on trend, or you just say, no, I need, like you said it perfectly, you need a paper trail, right? And you need to develop a best practice.
And at the end of the day, that's never going to be a deal breaker.
Right.
No, we're not signing this contract because we can't email it to you.
I think that's a fantastic point to raise, because I do think there's a lot of people who think that is a deal breaker if they don't do things over WeChat, right?
It possibly is, yeah. And it's and again, many of the SMEs I speak to, they will say to me, can I negotiate with Chinese companies? Can I mention this? Can I mention that? And let's just say, yes. Throw it all on the table. It'll be fine. I mean, you may not reach a deal in the end, but you are very unlikely, vanishingly unlikely, to propose something or suggest something that makes the other side say, no, this is a hard no, you've crossed a red line. The worst thing that they will do is say, no, I'm afraid we can't do that. Let's move on to another part of the discussion. when we bring companies together at CBBC, whether it's goods, services providers, investors, etc., there is a massive amount of flexibility on both sides, and there tends to be a large amount of goodwill on both sides.
Right.
I hate to begin sentences with, people in China are, because that's just a ridiculous stereotype. But to break that rule, when it comes to business, people in China are usually up for negotiating many, many different things, most things, and will approach such negotiations, with the correct positive attitude.
Right. What do you feel you've learned as an individual living now, having lived in 4 different cities? I mean, I don't want to focus really on the challenges you've had, but in general, what have you learned about doing business in China? Yeah.
I would say it actually relates to what you were saying again at the beginning about the whole knowledge is power. I've learned that you need to dig in to the data and the reasons. We've got coming up Double 11, which for those of your listeners who aren't aware of that, that is China's biggest shopping festival. So it's on the 11th of November, hence the name.
But I think it's important to highlight it's no longer just one day. It's a couple of weeks.
Oh yeah. Double 11 pre-sales start at the end of this month or early next.
I think they start 2 to 3 weeks prior to 11/11, and there's a little bit of after sales too. That
it does grow, and of course
it used to be one day, and now it's gently expanded.
And now there is, of course, what is it? The one in June, 6/18.
Yeah.
6/18, which was launched by a rival of the company Alibaba. Alibaba set up Double 11, so 6/18 was launched by JD, its rival, which again was traditionally on the 18th of June, I think, because that's the founding date of JD. I might be wrong on that, and that has also
11/11 for everybody to be aware is Singles Day in China originally.
Oh yes, because it's 1111.
Exactly.
So, and then also there's 12/12, which you've probably guessed from the pattern.
That's new. I don't know that one.
12th of December, that's like a mini 11/11.
Okay.
And then there are all of these other ones as well. So, of course, China has got 3 Valentine's Days per year, which is a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your perspective.
Who knew the Chinese were so romantic, right?
I know. And every year or two, you start to see posters in the subway of some random date that some online company is trying to market as the next, 3/7 or I don't know, 9/2, or they're trying to find another combination. And most of the time, you just never see these posters again. It's tried, they've failed, they've moved on. But sometimes they'll appear and it'll become a successful thing. But yeah, endless shopping festivals in China. But anyway, next month, yes, is 11/11, Singles Day. And there will be all sorts of hoopla in the news about how much were pre-sales worth, how many sales were made via live streaming, what were sales on the day, the first minute of sales, the first hour of sales. Those are interesting numbers, and it is interesting to compare year on year from a macro perspective. What does that reflect about the wider economy? But the fact is, if you're an SME from the UK or elsewhere, those numbers on their own, they probably don't impact you that much. You need to take that deep dive. It may well be the case, who knows, that Double 11 numbers are disappointing next month. It may well be the case that they shatter all expectations. But even if it is the former, so what if sales were slightly lower? If you're offering pet products, for example, you need to look specifically at what the sales of pet products were like. How did they compare to the previous year, so on and so forth. If you're offering, say, I don't know, makeup and cosmetics, what were sales like that? More specifically, what about the specific categories within that? What about, say, men's makeup, which certainly over the last couple of years has been doing really, really well in China. So when it comes to China, yes, there is a lot of data, but you can probably discount a lot of it because a lot of it is just so big. When I say big data, I'm not talking here about
numbers,
having a lot of numbers. It's literally just big numbers that sound impressive on a page, sound great when you're giving a speech about look at all the wonderful opportunities in China, but delve into those numbers, find the numbers that relate specifically to you. And certainly working in service delivery in China at CBBC, when I'm working with all of our sector specialists, this is something that I come across time and time again when working with them to make offerings to clients, when working with them to design and produce deliverables, when working with them to put together our reports. At the moment, I'm putting together our business guide and our business outlook for China in 2024. You can't just have those big macro numbers. You need to get to the nub of the problem. You need to include those very specific things. And that is something that 6 years at CBBC brings home to me still on a daily basis, pretty much.
I agree with you. I mean, numbers is critical. It's just figuring out which numbers you actually have to look at and analyze, right?
Yeah.
Before we get to our final question, I think, you highlighted you're doing the guide for 2024. I told you prior to recording, because you're actually our next guest speaker that's going to be going live anyway, that I spoke with Ryan Malloy from Redfern. And our conversation kind of drifted off into what were our expectations in 2023? And have those expectations come into fruition? And what do we see in 2024? So let me just give you an update very concisely about what Ryan and I thought. So Ryan thought that 2023 was going to boom. And he's been a bit disappointed by the results this year. And his expectation is obviously that 2024 should rise, but he's got certain doubts after not hitting certain expectations this year. My feeling was borders have opened up in January 2023. I felt that people had to reacquaint themselves with China. So I didn't have expectations. I did not know what was going to happen. And I have to be honest with you, there were moments definitely in the first half of the year where I didn't know if China would close the borders again. So I was hesitant about my expectations. I was being very conservative, and I really didn't expect any growth, quite frankly. It has grown better than I anticipated, which obviously is better for me in terms of my motivation compared to Ryan. But I will say this, that for 2024, if things do not pick up, I will be extremely disappointed in China itself, because it means that there is certain blockages, whether it's from the government, whether it's from the economy. And I that's my hope for 2024, that there will be this boom. From what you're seeing on the ground in Shanghai, Ben, what were your expectations for I don't want to say what was CBBC's expectations, just you were on the ground, you experienced the lockdowns physically. What were you expecting in 2023 when the government was like, okay, borders are now open?
I suppose I was probably, like many people, and again, I'm not really speaking for CBBC here, I was probably overly optimistic and thinking, okay, great, things are going to get back to normal, immediately.
Did you think overnight?
I didn't think overnight, but I thought, I suppose, because when you hear the borders are opening, you're so happy.
Yeah.
And you do have that positivity bias, perhaps, to some extent. When I look back, those sort of expectations that I personally had were probably unrealistic. I suppose it's like when you're, if you're looking forward to, I don't know, a new film or an album or something like this, and you build up expectations so much in your head, the borders have been closed for 3 years, and then they open up and you've got all these expectations, and it will never quite live up to what you expected.
Right.
But then with the benefit of hindsight, when you can have some distance, as we've got now at the other end of the year, and you look back, you can say that actually things have gone pretty smoothly. We've seen a good steady stream, certainly from my side, of SMEs coming back, re-engaging with the China market. We get it that there's a bit of hesitancy, and but the trend is good. Certainly when you look at, say, the medtech sectors, green sectors, experience economy, sports, seeing some great stuff in there. Still the evergreens of food and drink, consumer, financial and professional services, as ever, for the UK. But yeah, I think maybe some of those expectations had been built up over 3 years. It was like a coiled spring, and we expected it to, bang, spring back, and it didn't quite. But with the benefit of hindsight, was it ever going to do that? really.
I didn't think so, but
Well, there you go. Yeah,
but
you saw
but
them.
but I understand. I mean, Ryan has been expanding into Southeast Asia, so he
Yeah,
left China, right? You've been physically on the ground, and it's interesting to hear three people's different perspectives depending on he escaped. I left in 2020. We're still on the ground.
yeah, yeah.
It's interesting to hear how people are feeling, right, about the market. What what are you feeling about next year?
Reasonably positive. I should say again, to go back to the data point. I'm still putting that report together, so I'm not going to I'm not going to nail my colours to the mast yet because I haven't finished the analysis. And you should know your song well before you start singing, of course. But from from conversations with members and our wider stakeholders here in Shanghai, throughout China, and indeed in the UK, yes, reasonably positive. We know that there are issues in China. We know that there can be uncertainties, but we also know that this remains the world's largest middle class. We know that it remains the world's second biggest economy. It's still going to grow by around 5% this year. And look at me, I have descended into giving all those big, big, big numbers again, which I warned against just 5 minutes ago. So if you want to know what we think will happen in 2024 at CBBC,
Stay tuned.
download our guide in December.
When do you think it'll be published?
We will be publishing our business guide and our outlook. Sorry, download our outlook in December.
Yeah.
In December.
Okay. So do stay tuned for that, guys. It's
Yes.
only a couple of weeks away.
And it'll be free.
And it's something to use, right, as a guide. It's a data point to look at. So let's finish off today. I always finish off with the same question, Ben. What is one piece of advice you would have given yourself sitting for 14 hours in the airport of Hong Kong before flying off to Wuhan? What's the one piece of advice you would have given yourself?
I probably would have given myself this advice a week before I left, but I would advise myself to get yourself to a bookstore, basically. Go and buy some books about China. Fiction, non-fiction, history, current affairs, the economy. I don't just mean a book about doing business in China. I mean the wider perspective. There are so many resources about China, whether it's newsletters, podcasts like this one, social media content on WeChat and other platforms, as we were talking about before. And all of that is useful and relevant. You open my email, my mailbox, it's full of subscriptions to newsletters, and I listen to podcasts all the time about China and all this. And a lot of those are good because they are reacting to what has happened recently. They are the first take that they can respond to real world events. However, I do think when you're serious about China, you can't just rely on those things. You need you need that base, which I'm probably going to come across as old-fashioned now, but that only proper books can give you. So honestly, if you're going to come to China and actually say live here, whether it's you're being sent here for a year or two with your company, or actually looking to be here long term, or even frankly, if you're just looking to trade here or invest here, but a lot of your business is going to be associated with China, get yourself a good history book about China. Just learn about the country. Start from the beginning. Read some fiction written by Chinese authors. It doesn't need to be related to business at all, because at the end, it all kind of relates together. And you'd be surprised how much, when you learn about one thing, can suddenly be relevant elsewhere.
I find that.
So yeah, just get yourself to a bookshop and read.
I find that really fascinating.
Read.
That you mentioned that. Nobody has actually mentioned that is get a foundation, get a personal foundation on China, right? Exactly. And there are a hell of a lot of resources out there, and I like the idea of getting fiction stories, or even watching the Joy Luck Club. That just popped into my head. Certain things like that are great resources to understand a little bit more about the history. And I just want to highlight, I've just started actually a children's book called Horrible Stories with my son, and it's all about the horrible wars that have happened throughout time. And there is a specific small little book it's actually for kids on China. So
Oh,
if you don't want to read thick books like this, but just want to have a basics, even educate your kids who might be relocating, it's a great resource to look into that. And it's very funny. It's really well written. We've just started World War I, and I'm loving it myself. So yeah, definitely, Dave, I have no association with horrible stories, but it's just a great resource that I started with my own son on that. Ben, I really want to thank you for joining in. I know you've got a hard break now, but I appreciate you sharing and participating. And hopefully we can get you back on maybe next year to talk about the outlook and the guide. I
that
think
would
it
be
might be a
fantastic.
great
Yes.
resource to our listeners to hear what your conclusions are after your analysis.
Absolutely, yes. Very
So
willing to.
maybe in January we can pinpoint a date and have you on to kind of just sum it up in a 45-minute, 1 hour
Let's do
talk.
it. And then 11 months later, I can be on for a third time and explain why
Exactly.
everything went
Exactly.
completely differently. No, I'm sure it won't. But yeah.
So guys, stay tuned. I will be contacting Ben, and hopefully in January we can bring him on for another episode. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you very much for having me, Christina. Thank you for everybody who listened. And yes, thank you again to Woodburn for everything that you do and for all this content that you're producing. It's
Thank
been
you.
good to be on. Thank you.
Enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. Now, can Woodburn help you? I am offering a free 30-minute call where we discuss the obstacles you are encountering on your China business journey and how we can help accelerate your success. The link to my diary is in the show notes, and I look forward to speaking with you.